Hello again, chess fans, and welcome back to ChessLecture.com. I'm Dana Mackenzie, and today I'm going to be doing a lecture for you that I've been looking forward to for quite a long time. It's called Nuke the GM, and this is a reference to my first ever lecture at Chess Lecture. 8 years ago, I gave a lecture called Nuke the Sicilian, which was about a variation that I had discovered and tried in a tournament for the first time. It's a remarkable variation where white sacrifices a queen on the sixth move. And this queen sacrifice is not to force mate. It's not to gain any kind of overwhelming tactical advantage. It's a speculative sacrifice where I give up the queen for two pieces and just get a tremendously long-lasting bind. And in the lecture I gave 8 years ago, I showed a game that I had just played in a tournament in Reno called the Western States Open against international master David Pruess, where I was able to win in very fine style using this opening. Now, I've given about 160 chess lectures since then, and never had another opportunity to show you an over-the-board game with this opening until now. So earlier this month, once again in the Western States Open in Reno, I had a chance to play the Queen Sacrifice again, and this time not against an international master, but against a grandmaster, Sergey Kudrin. So I was, of course, really excited to get to try this at the very top level. And I think the opening was really a big success here. Now, this may be giving away spoilers, but I didn't win this game. It actually did end up being a draw, which, for me, a draw against a grandmaster is a great result. And not only that, it was, very close to being a victory. We'll talk about that when the time comes. But in any case, I felt that the opening itself did very well here, and I was never really in the remotest danger of losing. And that's such a pleasant situation to be in against a grandmaster, because they excel at, no matter what opening the game starts with, they excel at working the position to their advantage and sort of shifting the momentum and creating weaknesses and so forth. And Sergey Kudrin had no chance of doing any of those things in this game. Okay, so let's get started. I know you want to see this as much as I want to show it. So here we go. I'm white. Kudrin is black. I start with e4, c5, f4, the Grand Prix variation, and d5. So many people who play the Grand Prix will actually play a different move order. They'll start with knight c3 in order to discourage this d5 advance. However, I have a prepared line, and so I actually kind of want to encourage him to play d5, which in fact he did. And you might ask, why does he play this move? Well, this was sort of the theoretical, prescription against the Grand Prix that was discovered by Tal and others in the 1980s. And Kudrin, being, a good product of the Soviet chess school, basically believes that you should play the best move in any opening position. You shouldn't, be afraid of what your opponent might have prepared or something. And so he plays d5 because it's supposed to be the best move. Okay, I play knight f3, and this is the sort of beginning of the queen sac variation. So obviously, I'm offering a sacrifice of the e4 pawn. And this is inspired by the Budapest gambit. So it's really a Budapest with colors reversed, where I've gotten a chance to play the extra move f2 to f4. And one thing I did not know when I gave my first chess lecture, and found out a few months later, is that this gambit was not my invention. So it was discovered earlier in the 1960s by a Swedish correspondence player by the name of Axel Brintz. And he was actually quite good correspondence player. He won the Swedish championship at least once. and played several games with this gambit. And in fact, there are two ways to play. You could play either knight to e5 or knight to g5. They're both good, but I think the knight g5 is much more fun, as we're going to see. Okay, so I played knight g5. Kudrin plays knight f6, and I play bishop to c4. So this is key move in the variation, obviously attacking the f7 square, and black now is at a crossroads. So he can either stop that threat by playing e6, and this is what most sane players will do, and it's perfectly good for black, and maybe it's the main argument against playing this variation for white. Now, the thing about e6, it does block the queen bishop, so that's a little bit of a disadvantage from black's point of view, and it allows white to win back the gambit pawn fairly easily after knight to c3. On the other hand, black does get fairly straightforward development, and I think this position is basically equal. You know, whoever plays better will win. The other option for black, though, is to play bishop to g4. And here black is attempting an outright refutation of white's opening. So basically, he's saying, I'm going to ignore an attack on f7 because, look, your queen is hanging. And if you want to avoid losing the queen, you're going to have to retreat your bishop, and that looks really awful because it's a loss of tempo and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, of course, I have no intention to play bishop to e2, and I make that clear right away. I go queen takes bishop, exclamation point, or maybe 2 exclamation points. So queen sacrifice on move 6. How can this be? You know, the principles of chess say you couldn't possibly get away with such a thing. Well, let's see what happens. He goes knight takes queen, bishop takes pawn check, king to d7, bishop e6 check. Now, here black again has an option. He could play king to e8, which would invite a draw by repetition after bishop to f7 check. But I knew that Kudrin wasn't going to do this. First of all, Kudrin is a grandmaster, playing someone rated more than 400 points below him, so he's obviously not going to want to have a quick draw. Not only that, his situation in the tournament also compels him to play for a win. We're going into the last round tied with 3.5 points. We're a half point behind the leaders. And so in order for Kudrin to have a chance at a big prize, first place, he's got to play for a win this game. Now, I don't have the same limitation on me because I can also win an under 2200 prize. And in fact, all I need to clinch the under 2200 prize is a draw. So for me, the incentives are a little bit different. I am really okay with the draw. I'd be happy with the draw. That gets me a pretty big prize, and a win would just be like icing on the cake. So, so this difference in our incentives, I think, does play a role towards the end of the game, as we're going to see. And it even plays a role here, because I know for sure Kudrin's not interested in a draw. So you know, one slight downside of this opening is that if you're playing against a lower-rated player, or you're playing against someone who's okay with a draw, then you might not want to play this unless you yourself are also willing to draw. Okay. Anyway, so he plays king to c6, and I go bishop takes knight. And he goes e6. This is the move that Pruess played against me in the first game in 2006 that I lectured on 8 years ago. I think it's possibly black's best move. It's a little bit hard to tell for sure. There are other possibilities. But, you know, black is trying to develop his pieces normally. And he's not too worried about my trying to win the exchange for reasons that I will actually now discuss. So, in my lecture 8 years ago, I talked about the strategy behind this opening, and I really consider this to be more than an opening variation. It's an opening, it's a concept, or perhaps even a system. To play this variation successfully for white, you don't need to memorize a bunch of lines. Instead, what you need to understand is the principles behind the variation. And in my lecture 8 years ago, I outlined 5 principles for playing the variation. And I'll go over them again right now. So the first principle is active pieces for white. You want to try to coordinate your pieces as well as possible. White has 4 minor pieces to black's 2, and so success for white will depend on getting those pieces out, getting them developed, and working together. So that's principle 1. Principle 2 is restraint of black's queen. So that queen is the elephant in the room. Black has a queen, white doesn't. So it's imperative for white to keep that queen bottled up as much as possible. Don't let the queen penetrate into the heart of white's position. Don't let it start scarfing up weak pawns. Principle 3, and this is perhaps the most surprising one, is keep the files closed. And that means, for the most part, avoiding pawn trades. So why is that? Well, black has 3 straight moving pieces, or vertical moving pieces, the 2 rooks and the queen. White has only 2. Therefore, if any files open up, it's going to be to black's advantage. So he's either going to be able to take control over the file, or else he'll be able to trade off white's rooks. And either one is not something that white really wants. So opening files is really the key to black getting some counterplay. And so white wants to keep files closed at all costs. Now, eventually, white will have to open files, some files, because it's in the nature of chess that eventually you'll have some pawn trades and so forth. But what white aims for is to develop all of his pieces and control the board sufficiently before there are any pawn trades, that when there finally are pawn trades, white can either minimize the danger due to the open files, or maybe even use the open files himself. So that's principle 3. Keep the files closed. Principle 4, don't cash in too early. And that's really relevant in this position. I do not want to go for the exchange too quickly, because even if I succeed in winning the exchange, my knight is going to be way over on h8, completely disconnected from the rest of my army, and meanwhile the rest of my minor pieces are not developed. So don't take the exchange until you've got all of your pieces out and working together. And in fact, one thing you're going to see in this game, as well as the earlier game I lectured on, is that eventually black is going to beg you to take the exchange. And so you're going to have plenty of chances to win back the material. So don't cash in too soon, principle 4. And the last principle is, if possible, try to trade a knight for black's remaining bishop. And the reason behind this principle is that if white trades a knight for the bishop, then white will have 2 unopposed bishops. Black won't have any bishops at all. And you're going to see how strong those bishops are. Basically, those 2 bishops are as strong as black's 2 rooks. And so it's a big step forward for white if he can get that trade to happen. So those are the 5 principles. We'll see how they work in this game. And they really make playing this opening easy for white, whereas, where black is completely lost, black has no idea what's going on in this position. White has, straightforward, rules that help him orient himself and choose between the many alternatives that there are going to be. Now, let me make one more strategic comment, which is, you'll notice that I didn't say anything in there about attacking black's king. And that might be surprising too, because usually you think, oh, white sacked the queen, he must be trying for some kind of mating attack. But that's not actually the main idea. I think white will go for an attack if he can, but he's really thinking longer term than that. However, I do think white should take the chance to make black's king uncomfortable and keep black's king out in the open if possible. And I think the one mistake I made in this game was not doing enough along those lines, as we're going to see in just a bit. Okay, so now let's continue with the game and see what happened. Okay, so I played knight to c3. So the one piece of black's I do want to win as quickly as possible is the e4 pawn, because that pawn is restricting my development. So I talked about not cashing in too soon, but I do want to win this pawn. He goes knight to d7. And here's where the game varies from the earlier game with Pruess, because Pruess had played knight to a6. And in fact, knight to a6 is what, I've played this game, this opening, over 100 times against various computer programs over the years. And knight to a6 is what the computer almost always plays. So I'm well prepared against this. Ironically, I haven't really played ever against knight to d7 because the computer doesn't play it, and I haven't played it much against humans. So from this point on, I'm actually kind of also in positions I haven't seen before. But as I said before, it doesn't matter, because all that matters is the principles, and the principles will guide me. Okay, so first step is to take away that pawn that's interfering with my development. He goes knight to f6, and of course attacking my bishop, so I bring the bishop back, and now of course I am kind of eyeing his king, threatening knight takes knight, discovered check. So he goes knight takes knight, I go bishop takes knight, check, and he goes king to b6. Of course he can't go king to c7 because I would fork his king and queen. So king to b6 was played. And here's where, according to the computer, I made a mistake. And I think the computer may be right. So interestingly enough, Rivka now rates the position as equal, which I say is interesting because a few years ago when I started playing this, computers just didn't get it. But now, Rivka's starting to get it. So it says white's already equal in this position, and it gives two possible moves. First, it suggests knight to f7, but as I said before, I'm against that on principle. So the principle is that white should complete his development first, then look for to recover his material. So the computer may be right, but I don't like that move. Okay, but the other choice that Rivka suggested, I think, would be an improvement for me, namely to play a4. And the idea here is, again, to try to get to black's king before he can get to safety. So if I can play a5 check and chase his king to a6, he's never going to be comfortable there. On the other hand, if black stops this with a6 or a5, well, now he's creating some new weaknesses, and his king is still not going to be comfortable. And in fact, I might even be able to lift a rook and start attacking the king that way. So I think a4, the computer likes it, and I think it's definitely worth attention as a possible improvement. But, I stuck to my principles. I played d3. Principle 1, activate my pieces, coordinate them. Okay. Kudrin plays queen e8. It's an interesting move. So he does not want me to play knight f7, and he's also protecting e6, and he's got ideas of maybe playing e5. I play bishop to e3, eyeing his king a bit, in particular I'm trying to discourage the idea of playing c4 and bishop to c5, which would give him a much better game. And he goes king c7, so now he's bringing his king back to safety. And his idea is basically to play rook to d8 and castle by hand. And he succeeds at this, and this is one thing that makes me think that I should have done more to make his king uncomfortable while I had the opportunity. I castle. He goes h6, chasing the knight. I go knight to f3. He goes bishop to d6. And now is an interesting position. And I actually took a while on this move, debating several possibilities. One move you might be tempted by is knight to e5, because looks like a great square for the knight, very dominating square, and if bishop takes knight, well, I've succeeded in trading the knight for the bishop, as I said earlier. Trouble with this move is that it opens the f-file, and after black plays queen to e7, he can then bring his rooks over to the f-file, and basically, I think black would be doing fine here, because now his rooks have something to do. If nothing else, he can trade them off, and queen against two bishops and a pawn, the advantage would be clearly to black. So I don't want this kind of liquidation. So the move I played was rook to e1. Simple move, just bringing out all my pieces, eyeing the queen, which is down at the other end of the e file, and discouraging again the break e5. Okay, he plays rook to d8. And one thing let me mention here is that he had some opportunities in this game to sacrifice a pawn in order to open the position up. And this may be the way that black needs to play this opening. I've talked about what white should do. It's possible that black should think about something like g5. This is the move I was the most worried about, where black is sacrificing a pawn back, but opening up the h file and getting a lot of pressure on that h2 pawn. Now, of course, I can play h4, and things are okay for the time being. And of course, in the end game, things may even be pretty good for me because I got two passed pawns on the king side. But this is a very different game from the one we end up in. It's one where black's rooks, again, have things to do. They can go to the f file or they can go to the g file. So if you're looking for improvements for Kudrin, this might be one. But as I said, he has a very definite plan. He wanted to get his king to safety, and that's a very reasonable plan. And plus, I think also he's playing, this is the first time he's ever seen this, and so he's playing fairly sensible chess. He thinks that all he needs to do is get his king to safety, finish development, and that then the extra material will basically win the game by itself. Well, that's wrong. It won't. But there's no way he could have known that. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this opening, is that in spite of white's being behind in material, white gets and maintains a bind that black simply cannot escape. Okay, so black plays rook d8. I play g3. The idea here, I want to drop my bishop back to d2 and c3, and so I need to make sure the f4 pawn's defended. He plays king b8, bishop to d2, queen e7, bishop to c3. And now he does rook to f8. And as I said, he's got his developments complete, so now he thinks that the game is going to win itself. All right, we'll see that he's not right. I do knight to e5. And of course, this is a beautiful outpost for the knight and threatens knight to g6. So he takes the knight off. And so principle 5, trade the knight for the bishop. So I'm very happy to see this trade happen. I go bishop takes bishop check. And now look at these two bishops. They have such power on both sides of the board. So, and compare them to black's rooks, which really don't have much to do. That's why white is doing well in this position. Okay, king a8. I play bishop to g6. Still, I'm nervous about him playing g5 at some later point, so want to stop it. Also, I'm freeing up the square e4 for my rook, for reasons we'll see, because actually black here, this is the one point in the game where I think black has a really significant improvement, and that's he could have played c4 here. Now, I wasn't too worried about this in the game because I would play d4, and it's the same idea of keeping the files closed. But the computer finds a really nice line for black, which is queen to b4, tickling this pawn, and it's a little bit of a nuisance. The key is if I play b3, then black trades and then smashes my center with rook takes pawn. And after bishop takes rook check, queen takes bishop, now black, I think, has a clear advantage. He's got a queen against a rook and a bishop, and he's got open lines for his rooks and for his queen. So this would have been not so good for me. So I'm lucky that Kudrin was not really thinking yet about pawn breaks. He plays rook to d7 instead, which, as far as I can see, doesn't really do anything. So I play rook to e4. Now he can't break on c4 because I'll take with the rook. He plays a6. Now, why did he play a6? I think that he was actually probably already thinking about playing the move rook to f6 to put the question to this bishop. And the idea is bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, and this would fork my bishop and pawn and enable his queen to get into the heart of my position. And remember, principle 2 was restrain black's queen. So this would be this is a bad thing for me to allow. Now, I have a nice move here, though, which is f5. It doesn't really have time to take on b2 because I would take on e6, and that pawn would be very fast. So, but what about pawn takes pawn? Well, here I have rook takes pawn, attacking the queen. And if he goes queen takes bishop, then I get rook to f8 check, and it's mate on the back rank. So he, I think, saw all this and realized that he needed to create luft for his king. And so that's why he plays a6. All right. I play h4. So now I want to meet the rook lift with h5, protecting the bishop. He goes queen d8. Ideas of bringing the queen out to b6, or even more, out to a5. And again, the queen is looking for ways to penetrate my position. And so a5 would be a really good square for it to go to. I play a4. So this is designed to stop the queen a5 threat. If he does this now, I play bishop to c3. And, as I said, notice the great piece coordination, the way the rook, protects to the side and also is looking in front, the way the bishop, serves multiple roles. This is really very pleasant position for white. Okay, now he does his idea of rook f6. And I told you earlier, eventually your opponent is going to beg you to take the exchange. Well, I don't want to take the exchange because now if bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, as I said, it's going to be a problem. He's getting his queen active, and I want to restrain that queen. So I don't take. I play h5. Now he goes queen b6, and now he wants to play c4 with the discovered check. So I play king to g2, and once again, no threat. And I really think that at this point, black must be getting frustrated, because here he's got these powerful pieces, this queen and these rooks, and they just don't do a darn thing. So this is what life is like for black in this variation. So he plays rook to d4, and this is my favorite moment, I think, of the whole game, because he's saying, please, please take one of my rooks. And I say, no, I don't want your rooks. I like my bishops. Thank you very much. So now, one idea of rook to d4 is he wants to take on b2, so I simply play b3, stopping that idea. So what's black going to do? Well, he trades the rooks. I go bishop takes rook. He goes rook to f7. So the half-price sale on rooks is over. I play bishop to c3. Principle 1 again. Principle 2, restraining black's queen. I want to keep an eye on these dark squares and not let the queen penetrate. All right, he goes queen d8. I don't know where he's going. I go rook to e1. Okay, obviously the rook wants to eye that e6 pawn. He goes rook d7. Again, a move with no threat. What's the rook going to do? I go bishop to f3. Again, eyeing the pawn, so he's got to defend it. He goes rook back to e7. So notice the utter powerlessness of black's position, even though he's ahead in material. I played rook to e5. Now I'm tickling the c pawn. And if you want to understand why black's having trouble, look at all the weak pawns he's got to worry about. He's got e6. He's got c5. He's got g7. He's got b7. he's got to keep an eye on all of these weak points, and it's tough for him to do, even with the material advantage. He goes queen d6. I go bishop to b2 with the idea of bishop a3 attacking the c5 pawn. So he anticipates that with rook to c7. I go back rook to e4. Now I'm threatening bishop to e5 with the skewer. And so he goes back to e7. And now this is a very interesting moment in the game, because this is where I make my second mistake. So I played rook back to e5. And frankly, one reason was I was just, I wanted to go back and forth one time just to gain time on the clock. But the rook actually isn't the piece that belongs on e5. The piece that belongs on e5 is the bishop. And I did not appreciate what a strong move this is when I was playing the game. So basically, it's going to turn out to be impossible for black to protect his c-pawn. So for example, if queen to d8, I'm going to go rook to c4, and the c-pawn is a goner. If he goes queen to c8, then I can do either d4 or b4 and win a pawn. Or if he goes queen to, let's see, going back here, if he goes queen to b6, once again, rook to c4. And now the threat of b4 is very strong because there are checkmate threats, or at least, okay, let's try playing. What do we play for black here? Say we play a random move like rook to d7, b4. So now the threat is to get in here, check him on the back rank, and then discover check and win his queen. So turns out there's just no really good way out for black, and so white simply wins the pawn, and that's a big step in white's favor. So I should have played bishop e5. Instead, I played rook e5, and now we get another interesting move from the psychological point of view. So I'd said before, Kudrin does not want to draw for rating reasons and for tournament reasons. And so he is now worried that I'm going to do a threefold repetition. And so in this position, he, I think, felt like he had to come up with something different from the move he played before. And so he plays a5 instead, which is a very strange-looking move to me. Because remember, I talked about all his pawn weaknesses. Well, he just created another one. He's got a weak pawn on a5 as well. So this move just helps me out for no reason at all. So I'm really surprised by this move. And in fact, I was surprised when I analyzed the game at how many mistakes Kudrin makes in the last few moves here. And I think it probably, well, first of all, it has something to do with time trouble, because he has like 1 minute left to make 4 moves. So, of course, that's an issue. But also, I think that you're seeing the sustained effect, the psychological effect of this opening, where black has been on the defensive, completely unable to generate any kind of threats for so long. And I think even against a grandmaster, that kind of pressure takes its toll. So a5, mysterious move. Bishop to c3. Now another mysterious move. He doesn't even protect the pawn. He goes king to a7. A terrible move as far as I can tell. Having played a5, he should at least defend the thing. And maybe he didn't do this because I can play bishop to g4, and he can't hold on to all of his pawns. But here he could play b6, bishop takes pawn, and in this position, material is more or less equal. But I think he can play here. Actually, he's got somewhat, a fairly well-consolidated position, finally. I don't have any passed pawns. I think it'd be very difficult for white to win this position. So this is, if he's going to give back a pawn, as he has to now, I think that was the way to do it. But instead, he plays king to a7, and I get the a pawn for free. Thank you. He plays queen d4. Okay, Now we are seeing the one consequence. I took the pawn, and this now allows his queen finally to penetrate my position. So I talked about queen restraint, principle 2. I did the best I could. I restrained his queen for like 35 moves, but now it's finally going to get in. I go bishop to e1. He goes b6. He needs to do this because my threat was to play bishop f2, followed by bishop takes pawn check, winning the house. So he had to go b6, and now I go a5. And at this point, I was sure I was going to win this game because I just thought black's position was collapsing. But it turns out to be more complicated than I thought. He plays queen b2, which is a good move. Okay, so like I said, finally his queen is doing something. I go pawn takes pawn check, king takes pawn, and now I play a move that I think really surprised him. I played bishop to f2. And he thought a long time after this. We've reached the time control, so he could think a long time. And I think he was a little dismayed to see this move because, first of all, well, obviously he'll play queen takes pawn. And what he's afraid of, he's not worried about rook takes pawn. That's not the issue because he would be glad to go into this endgame. Okay, so one of these two crippled pawns is going to die, and black is going to end up, slightly ahead in material. And, he's a grandmaster. He might be able to win this, so I didn't want to go for that. So the key thing, though, is that white can play b4, exclamation point. And first of all, notice that if queen takes pawn, I get bishop takes pawn check, forking the king and rook, and winning. So he can't do that. If he tries to get out of the pin with king a6, I go rook takes pawn, and now the shocking thing is, not only am I attacking his queen, I'm also threatening checkmate. So if he goes queen takes pawn, rook to a5 ends the game. And this is a beautiful example of what I talk about, what I mean when I talk about piece coordination. I'm down to 3 pieces, the 2 bishops and the rook, but they coordinate perfectly. So probably black's best move here would be rook to c7, but after pawn takes pawn check, I think it's really, really grim for black. And so Kudrin looked and looked and looked and looked, and finally admitted that he couldn't take on c2, and he played rook to c7 instead. And okay, well, here goes another pawn. Rook takes pawn check. King b5, and finally rook to e2. So now I'm up to complete material equality, really material advantage at this point. 2 bishops and 3 pawns versus a queen. So he's clearly fighting to save a draw at this point. He plays queen a1. And this is, again, not the best move. It turns out he should have kept his queen on, where it's eyeing the c2 pawn. But he goes queen a1. And I also didn't play the best move. So after the game, one of the spectators, and there were a lot of people watching this, said, you should have played rook to e4. And the point here is that if he attacks the c pawn, I can bring my rook to c4, where it's both defending the pawn and doing something aggressive. It's attacking the c pawn. It's supporting one of these pawn breaks, either b4 or d4. And black will not be able to keep me from doing those moves forever. And so this move really is terrific for white. White is probably just winning there. So I kind of had a blind spot in this game for this whole rook to c4 idea. Very unfortunate. So I didn't do rook to e4. Instead, I played bishop to e1. And my idea is I'm trying to set up c4 and b4. And now he plays queen f6, and he offers a draw. And I took the draw, which I know will disappoint some of you. One of my blog readers said, no guts, no glory. And, I plead guilty. I was a little worried about playing out what I thought was going to be a difficult endgame, a long difficult endgame against a grandmaster with a sudden death time control. So we both have about 30 minutes left. So I was given the option of, take a draw right away, get my big prize, $600, or fight on for a long time for an uncertain chance at victory and not that much more money. So I decided to take his offer. Do I regret it? I don't really regret accepting his offer, but there is one thing I do regret, which is that in all of this, I didn't actually think about the chessboard. I was thinking about prize money, I was thinking about the clock, I was thinking about his rating. I didn't think about the actual position. And whenever someone offers you a draw, the rules of chess require them to make a move first. And there's a reason for that. They've got to commit themselves. It's like in poker, they got to show you what their cards are. And before you accept that draw, you should look and see if those cards are as bad as you think, or as good as you think. So I should have looked at the variation I had intended to play. C4 check. It's a great move. If he goes king to a6, the game is over. Okay, bishop a4 check, and a5 check, and I win everything. So he's got to go to b6, and then I have b4. And again, this is just a great move. If he takes the pawn, then I play bishop to f2 check. And once again, he can't run to the a file. He gets mated if he does. So he's got to go rook to c5, and then I win his rook outright with rook to e5. Now he could try to run his pawn, but it doesn't get where it's going. I go rook check, and next move I'll play d4, and then I'll win his pawn. So this is just looking really awesome. Now the computer says black has only one good option, which is rook to d7, and then this gets kind of complicated. After bishop f2, rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check. This is a tough endgame, and the computer gives me about a one-pawn advantage. It's hard to say if white's winning here or if it's just still kind of in flux. Obviously, white has the advantage. I don't know if white has a forced win yet. Would have been interesting to find out, but I wouldn't have regretted accepting a draw in that position. But the one thing I do regret is that I didn't actually analyze the line. I just took the draw here. And so that's a good lesson for me. When someone offers you a draw, just look at the position one more time and ask yourself, was his last move really the right move? And here I don't think it was. Anyway, so a little bit of an unsatisfying conclusion, but a great game for the opening, for the Prince Gambit, proving that even GMs don't know what to do against it. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something from it. You learned that two bishops sometimes can be better than a queen, or at least they can fight with the queen. So, for ChessExtra.com, till next time, this is Dana Mackenzie, signing out.